Welcome to the second hour of Classical Sunday. I'm Peter Lloyd. As I continue this series of conversations with composers living and working in New Mexico, I'm pleased to be joined this week by Michael Mauldin, who moved to New Mexico from Texas in 1971 for what he called its space, light, and timelessness. Since then, he's completed a Master's of Music degree in composition at the University of New Mexico. He has served as the president of the New Mexico Music Teachers Association, the Albuquerque Music Teachers Association, the New Mexico Composers Guild, and as a national chairman of the Music Teachers National Association Student Composition Contest. He was named the National Composer of the Year in 1980 by the Music Teachers National Association, Teacher of the Year in 1984 by the New Mexico Music Teachers Association, and Private Teacher of the Year in 1996 by the New Mexico Symphony Orchestra. He served for 7 years as music director of the Albuquerque Boys Choir, which grew to 3 choirs, 85 boys between ages of 7 and 17 who tour, record and proceed through a rigorous musicianship program. His choral compositions have sold thousands of copies in the USA, Europe and Australia. Welcome, Michael Mauldin, to Classical Sunday. Well, Michael, perhaps we should begin by the prime mover in all of these activities, your passion, I think, to be a composer.
Composing, making up music as a little kid, barely able to reach the keys, was always my first love. But when I was in high school, I played in my father's church. He was a pastor. Yeah. And one of the people there heard me and wanted me to teach their sons piano. And of course, as a high school boy, I thought, oh gosh, I'm not interested in that. Turned out to be a lot of fun, and I've been doing it ever since.
Mm-hmm. You moved to New Mexico for, it sounds almost spiritual reasons. It made a deep impression on you, this country that we live in.
It did, and that was actually many years before I moved here. I was only about 11 or 12 when we attended church-related seminars at Ghost Ranch. Oh, yeah. And we traveled over many of the western states, but the strongest attachment I felt anywhere was to northern Mexico. So, in fact, I wrote short pieces on the little piano in the convocation hall, and when I got home, I couldn't believe somehow in my childish notation the space and color of the land seemed to be there, and I thought, oh, well, I've got to live in a place like this. And, of course, then I went to Kansas and Colorado and did various colleges. And finally, then, in 71, decided to come here and had no plan, no job. I just moved here because I felt like I needed to be someplace like that. Yeah, yeah. You know, I can remember my wife and I moved from New England about 20 years ago to New Mexico. And now I don't pay much attention, but I remember the drive up north from Albuquerque to Santa Fe. And that, everything you say, that sense of light and spaciousness, and it's very affecting. It catches a hold of you, and you never want to leave. Michael, earlier in the month, you presented a paper at the meeting of the American Society for Aesthetics that met here in Santa Fe earlier in the month. The panel that you were part of considered, quote, New Mexico landscapes in the non-visual arts, quote. You began your presentation with this foreword, repeating, I think, your early assessment of this place. Quote, I shared the narrative of how I became involved in trying to use music to celebrate an environmental essence, end quote. That's quite an undertaking. Perhaps we should talk first about the particular environments here in New Mexico that affected you so deeply. I know that chief among them was Chaco Canyon. Right. It certainly wasn't the first place that grabbed me. I think the first one that I actually tried to write about, if you can write about anything in music, there's a long debate about that, of course, but was Enchanted Mesa across from Acoma Pueblo, or Sky City, as it's referred to. And so I entitled the first movement of a clarinet sonata I was writing for my wife to play, Enchanted Mesa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're going to play that later today.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, some years later, after having taught school all year and having no chance to compose or interest in it, I received a commission for a state and national competition, the Music Teachers National. I couldn't get started. I was dead in the water. Everything was false starts. But my wife took our 2-year-old to show off our son to relatives. So I drove to Chaco for the first time. I had been here some years,
mm-hmm.
but had never been there. And I was just completely smitten and bowled over.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
it
not,
has that effect, doesn't it?
And yet, when you tell people about it who come here, and you say, "Now look, this is not Canyon de Chelly. You don't have the big dramatic vertical cliffs. It just looks like a big wash."
Mm-hmm.
But that's not why it's significant. Mm-hmm. And as I said, I sensed a kind of somehow in my bones a shift from tribalism, where they are killing each other and taking their people and goods, to a sort of a grand cooperative experiment. Because there were really 3 different groups, which we know they separated into 3, but perhaps they also were separate before the hundreds of years of Chaco's heyday. And as I put in that paper, if that's the case, then I guess they were the quintessential Americans. It was the idea of let's put our stuff together and work together. Mm-hmm. And it lasted beautifully for actually longer than our history in this country. We're not 300 years old yet.
Yeah, it's easy to get over ambitious about the reach of history in America.
Right.
So you go to an inspiring place. It encourages a deep reflection on your part, deep reflection, and I sense some kind of emotional response to the place. In your process, those strong feelings generate music. How? I mean, that you come up with. The feeling is first, the notation, the fragments of a melody, or
what seems odd to people, because so many times people have given me a little bit of flack about all these programmatic titles about places, and they say, well, then you must be a place-oriented person rather than a people-oriented person, and it's just the opposite.
Oh, okay.
The place is what grabs me, perhaps because of its stark beauty, or sometimes even its harshness, because that's the way this wonderfully incongruent place is in New Mexico. Yeah. We have everything. All the extremes are here, mixed together in a very incredible way. So maybe it's the landscape that starts it, but then immediately I start imagining the life of the people that lived here. That's what happened at Enchanted Mesa. I was up there with my hands and feet in the hand and toe holes, going up the side of the mesa, and suddenly feeling something about, imagining at least, what the people might have felt at that time. So in a way, it's then, of course, how you translate that, and this was why the paper at the Aesthetics Institute was a challenge, because there is a branch of philosophy and aesthetics which is so reductionist that it's, my very point was to try to celebrate an environmental essence. And of course, before you even open your mouth, one of them raises their hand and say, that's not possible, But that's a little like the argument about, in fact, one of them said this. I didn't open my mouth during that session, but this wonderful old professor said, I play the Moldau for my classes who don't know much about this, and I ask them what they're thinking about. And after years of doing this, only 1 or 2 mentioned water.
Yes.
All of them talked about air or wind or moving or whatever. And he was so proud of himself, and I felt like saying, you have totally missed the point. That programmatic music is not, it is, to, in my view, to combine the best of the gestures that are in music that reflect our shared physical existence, like gravity, magnetism, movement, stasis, all of these sorts of things, together with the power of a suggestion, either through just the title or, as in the old days, where there was actually a story written in the program that you were supposed to follow, which I don't do, although, again, narrative is important to me, so that as I'm writing, I think about, as I say, the people who live there, and so my mind begins to imagine what would a day have been like in the life of someone in Chaco, and so then a narrative develops, and you find yourself trying to say it in music, but I don't say, now here so-and-so happens, and it's not quite that programmatic.
It's a sense of setting an atmosphere. Yes?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, we have some of your recordings here, and among them, I have two things. I have, perhaps since we've been speaking about Chaco, we should play something from Voices from Chaco.
Okay.
And do you want to just lead us into that with a comment on how this piece came to be?
Yeah, this was the one that was a commission. It later won a national competition. I was actually named Composer of the Year in 1980 for the whole country by Music Teachers National. But somehow I felt I didn't fully deserve the honor because I used a lot of craft, but I was visited by flow, and I was very grateful for that. And so but that was the piece that was written after that first trip to Chaco, where I was so overwhelmed with the energy and the work and effort that those people put in, in this incredibly difficult place. What I think we're going to hear today is just the first movement of the Voices from Chaco. It's a concertino for piano and woodwind quintet. And, of course, if people are not familiar with that sound, it might strike them a little odd, and they may wonder why not write a piano concerto. This, since it was written for a Music Teachers Association, my goal was to write something for a very talented young high school or college student that couldn't assemble an entire orchestra, but might be able to find 5 good woodwind players to do the accompaniment. And in this movement, there are 2 main themes, it basically sonata allegro form. The first one I called my Silent Spring motive because somehow it gave me the feeling, a bit of a tragic feeling of, despite their love for it, somehow perhaps the Chacoans' abuse of the land or overuse of the land may have contributed, in addition to the horrible drought, to their having to leave. And then the second one, which is introduced, I believe, by the oboe, is jokingly I refer to as my transcendental motive, and after this piece I've used it many, many times. It's a descending half step and a descending major third, and then that repeated over and over, which takes you downward melodically, but up through the circle of fifths. You get this sensation of forces coming from above and below, and it was many years after that with my Enchanted Land Suite that I used Peggy Pond Church's statement about, I opened the piece, the narrator piece, with, what did she say? There are certain places in the earth where the great powers that move between earth and sky are closer and more available than others. And that's
nicely put, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Well, here it is. Here's the first movement from Voices from Chaco by my guest, Michael Mauldin.